I live in Colorado, and Rocky Mountain National Park is very close to me. I love the outdoors, so I go hiking all over my beautiful state. Usually it's just day hikes or being outdoors for 24 hours, something like that. Quick campfires and small dinners. Mostly me and my dog. Last fall, I went hiking in Big Lake on a trail called Tonahudu Creek. It was about 1:45 in the afternoon. I didn't have my dog with me at the time because they aren't allowed on these trails, so it was just me and me. I was heading southeast when all of a sudden there was complete silence. No wind, no animals, not even an odor from outside. It was like I was trapped in a bubble where nothing existed or where everything was muted. I pulled out my phone to check the time, but it was only 3:45, though it seemed like there was a strange fog around me too. I kept walking. The silence was still there, and so was the strange feeling. I walked for another good 10-15 minutes when I turned my attention to the sky, and it seemed to me that the clouds were moving fast, as if a thunderstorm was coming. There was no rain or snow in the forecast that day, so it was amazing to see the low clouds moving so fast, like I was watching a time-lapse. But then I heard a rumble coming from the ground. It was coming from what seemed to me to be the depths of the earth. A violent crack like thunder interrupted the rumble. The clouds stopped moving rapidly, but took on a very light pink or purple hue. At this point, I was walking, trying to get out of there. My fight or flight response seemed to have kicked in, and the adrenaline started pumping. The strange feeling in my gut turned to absolute terror, but there was nothing around that could cause such fear. There were no wild animals, no bears, no mountain lions. Then there was another crack and a flash of light, and everything seemed to return to normal. The wind had returned. The birds that had filled the air with sounds were now replaced by the sounds of crickets, and the strangest thing was that it was already 6:30 p.m. I was on my way back to the truck when all this happened, but it didn't take me that long to get back on the trail. It seemed like it had been 15 minutes, but it had actually been over 4 hours. I also don't remember what happened during that time, other than what I shared with you guys. I really only shared it with a few people. Some said I was kidnapped, others said I was caught in a deferment, or something like that. But honestly, I have no idea what happened. Anyway, I just wanted to share this to get it out. It happened when I was in college about 6 years ago. About 5. 30 p.m. after class, I had just said goodbye to my friend, and we were about to leave for home when a guy in a hooded sweatshirt blocked my path. As soon as the guy was in front of me, he put his arms around me and held my head against his chest. He also slapped my face and asked me, "Hey, why aren't you home yet?" I was at a loss for words, for I didn't know this guy. At first I thought he mistook me for someone else. I also thought he was drunk. But then he started grabbing me to go with him. I called my friend for help. Luckily, she was still around. She grabbed my hand and started playing tug-of-war with this guy. There were a lot of people at this point. The guy yelled, "Don't disturb us, that's my wife." The friend also shouted, "Help, please, this is my classmate." No one dared to help. We filmed the scene outside the school during rush hour and everyone just watched. We felt very helpless. I remember seeing a few familiar faces from the school, but they didn't move. They must have been as shocked as I was. I was paralyzed at the time too. I couldn't look away from the boy. However, another guy came up and shouted, "I'll shoot you." He was trying to help the other boy tear me away from my friend. One of my classmates tried to help, but the other guy hit him. The guy then punched me in the face. But they also hit my friend, who had the guts not to let me go. Of course, we kept shouting for help, and a street vendor came to our aid shouting, "She is a student, we must help." When she approached us, another guy hit her too. Eventually, the street vendor came with her dog, and after the guy hit her, her dog bit the guy. The dog also bit the guy who kept hugging me, and then both ran away while the dog chased them. The experience was really traumatizing. After that, I had to change my everyday clothes for months so that those two guys wouldn't recognize me when we meet somewhere. However, I am a huge dog lover, and having a dog rescue me was very gratifying. For a while, when I was still in college, I still occasionally met street vendors with dogs. But the two guys who I can only guess were trying to kidnap me, I never saw again. So, starting from the very beginning, when I was about 6 years old, and I'm now 18, I experienced 6 losses when I was 5 years old. All of the people I lost were very close to me. One of them was my grandmother. On my father's side, I had to move in with my mother's family. I was always close to my mom, so I was very happy about the move. But after the move, strange things started happening to all of us. I can only tell you about myself, but here's what happened. I would talk to my sister at night and wake up to find that she was never home, or lose something but find it in a completely different part of the house. It was all small at first. When we moved into our own place, it stopped for a while. But when we started visiting the house every weekend, it was like all these little things followed us to that apartment. My parents went to rehab to get clean, and we went back to the house. Chief among them was my Aunt Ruth. She and her boyfriend were both oxy addicts. She was also creepy. She would lock us up for 30 days and only let us out if we did the tasks she had to do to live there for free. She gave a 9-year-old a chainsaw, and it felt like work, and on the back porch with no supervision. But anyway, strange things started happening as soon as we moved there. We heard footsteps in the attic when no one was home. The windows don't open. There are little metal holes in the wall, and nothing can get through them. Or rumbling in the garage when everyone was in bed. But after Chris died, things took a turn for the worse. I never liked him, but there was nothing anyone could do. It was about a month or two after my parents moved into their house. It was downstairs next to the dining room. It overlooked the middle garage, the little room between the garage and the house. They always said they saw a man with long white hair walking back and forth and talking to himself, but it was always some kind of gibberish, not a single word with any real meaning. Chris had developed a habit of lying in bed and talking to someone that everyone, including me, assumed was himself. But one day I was asleep. It was about 7 in the evening, and it was like I had just woken up and was moving but not waking up. And I saw a woman walking down the street. She was very beautiful. She was wearing an ankle-length black dress, black high-heeled shoes, a pearl necklace, and big neat curls, and she was sitting on a bed. I realized she wanted me to talk to her. We got up and walked until we reached my aunt's bed, where Chris was lying there again, talking some gibberish to himself, and she was standing over him and putting her hand on my shoulder. And then she told me that he would be coming with us soon. And I woke up to Ruth arguing with Chris about the voices he'd heard, and of course she assumed they were drugs. And who wouldn't assume that, right? The next day his father found him hanging in the woods behind the family dry cleaners, and another week later his father hanged himself in the same woods. After all that happened, things mostly calmed down. I went to middle school, moved on to 8th grade, struggled with my mental health, and attempted suicide a few times. I was in and out of hospitals, eventually ending up in a group home, from which I was transferred to a long-term care hospital, from which I was sent home. But when I came back, things were different. Usually weird things happened at our house, but I went to a friend's house, and within a few days of me leaving, things happened there that would normally happen at my house, while my house was in order. The energy here has always been high. No one can relax. And my friends refuse to come over because something happens to them and their houses when they leave. This year, however, the worst and most horrifying events happened. The first was the phone call. My stepfather was sitting in a chair in his bedroom. We were smoking and he got a call and he put it on speakerphone so we could smoke some more. But no one was talking. It was just a broken keyboard. Then the woman repeated that her fingerprints were cold and she couldn't feel her fingers. Also, every man in my house has been sexually harassed. I feel like I have been targeted lately, and I was compelled to share this by an incident that happened last night. I was in my room naked because I had just taken a shower. I was combing my hair while sitting in my computer chair and covered myself with a towel to keep it dry. At first, I could have sworn someone was standing behind me. I felt like someone was watching me, like they were looking right at me, if that makes sense. Then I stood up to light the incense and began to pray. I swear to you that towel was pulled right out from under me. It was about 3:30 in the morning when I got into bed and turned off the light. I was about to fall asleep when I felt something that looked like a hand, only too big and too long, go around my knees and push me. I started praying as I was having a panic attack and ended up just running downstairs, grabbing my Bible, praying for about 20 minutes and then just falling asleep on the couch. While I was sharing this with you, 3 doors downstairs opened and closed. I was alone at home with my stepfather, and he was alone in his bedroom. I can't describe all the experiences my family and I had in that house because it would take forever. But if anyone wants to hear more or can even give me some tips, I'd be happy to share, and I'm all ears. In terms of where this story takes place, I live in a small college town near a medium-sized city. The town itself isn't very crowded and mostly exists to fulfill the demand that comes from the college. Because of this, the stores around the college are open 24 hours a day, and students can buy anything they like instantly. Another big seller here is gasoline. Of course, you can also buy gasoline in the city, but since this is a city that you often drive through to get to the city, many establishments try to keep the price of gasoline a little lower than many city stations. My story started with working nights at a gas station and liquor store while I was in college part-time, but mostly taking classes online so they wouldn't ruin my opportunity to get a full-time job. The store I worked at only had one person working at the store for a long time, while many people, especially girls, complained about the lack of cameras and the fact that the best people didn't always go into liquor stores and gas stations in the middle of the night. They did almost nothing about it. However, one night before I started working there, a woman walked into the owner's place to buy milk, went outside to her car, but a man came up behind her and put a gun to her back demanding money. She obeyed, and luckily he let her go. She ran into the store, sobbing hysterically, and although the police arrived soon after, they never found him. Personally, I would have preferred to have 2 people on it, even if there were no security issues. The night seemed to pass much faster with someone else around, and it was so nice to actually find common ground with someone I usually shut up with. There were 4 of us in total on the night shift: Josh, Nick, Dixie, and me. Dixie had another job, and she really only worked there as a favorite of one of the managers, so she only worked 2 nights a week with either Josh or me. Josh and I worked together 3 nights a week, and Nick worked with Josh or me 2 nights a week. Dixie was actually very sweet and fun, but she didn't particularly like the job and wanted to be there. It really annoyed Josh that she just stood behind the counter while he did all the work, but it was only 1 night a week, so he didn't complain too much. Nick, on the other hand, was a little different. He worked there 5 days a week, just like Josh and I, but he was never put with one person for more than 1 day a week. No one seemed to like him or want to work with him. Nick was a little out of sorts. He was one of those people who will tell you the whole story of his life the first time you meet him, giving you a bunch of very personal details that no one wants to hear. He always talked about how his marriage had been very difficult. Apparently, he had a serious drinking and drug problem, or something like that, for a long time, and the drugs got better when he was able to switch to pot, but he couldn't handle the booze. I'll admit it wasn't easy being around him, but you get used to some people in that kind of work. I had been working there for almost 3 months when Nick's story seemed to grow out of nowhere. He started telling people that he had been diagnosed as a psychopath when he was young and had to take a bunch of pills every day to keep from becoming violent. Not exactly what you want to hear from someone you're alone with in the middle of the night, right? But I guess that's okay. We all have our own issues, and some people are wrong when it comes to mental illness. I myself have always struggled to get my anxiety and depression under control, and without medication there's no way I would kill people, but I'd probably be hospitalized as a danger to myself. So, as horrible as it was, I assured him that many people need to take medication for some illnesses, and if you stick to it and are honest with your doctors, there is no reason why you can't do your best. He seemed satisfied with this answer, and soon afterward the conversation turned to other topics. After that, for the next week or so, he was particularly cheerful and kind to me, letting me know daily that he was taking his medication and feeling well. I always responded enthusiastically, but I'm sure everyone else, especially Josh, knew how much I wanted him to stop talking to me about it and just leave me alone. Josh had a wife and 2-year-old daughter at the time, so he couldn't help but see us young girls through the eyes of what his daughter might be facing at our age, and admittedly, he decided pretty quickly to stop me talking to Nick. I was grateful for that, and he didn't try to pretend to like Nick, as he never did. Nick soon started talking to me, going into great detail about why he was diagnosed rather than how his medications worked, which I won't describe because many of them were very violent and sexual. I repeatedly told him I didn't want to know about it, to which he pretended to understand and would change the subject of conversation, but would come back to it after about an hour. When I told Dixie about it, she said she would look into it and tell her friend, the manager who invited her to work. The manager didn't seem to be able to do much because I was the only one he could talk to about these things, and told me to come see her again if he ever made me feel uncomfortable. It started to get more stressful for everyone who worked with him, especially after the manager talked to him, and soon 2 other women who worked with him on the night shift told the manager about comments he had made to them about how nice it was. I was interviewed, during which I agreed that all of the women's statements were similar to what I had been told, and Nick was given a final warning and a recording was made. However, the next times I saw him, he started making comments about people snitching on him just because they didn't like him. I assumed he didn't know I was being questioned, and neither Josh nor I were going to tell him. But at one point he got so angry he almost cried, saying how lucky these people were that he was on medication and what he would have done to them if he wasn't. Luckily, his shift was over at that point, and almost immediately after he finished his work, Josh told him that we had a lot of work to do that evening, so we didn't have time to talk to him. And then he nodded and walked out the door without another word. Josh wasn't lying either. The truck had arrived very late that day, so there was still quite a bit of stuff that needed to be shelved. But the previous changes had never happened without absolute necessity. I think it was much easier to do it at night, when there were far fewer customers. It was annoying because we couldn't talk, but we just got over it. I don't remember when Josh went into the cooler with the drinks, but it must have been pretty late since we had been there for quite some time by then. I was still concentrating on filling the shelves and making sure everything looked stocked, which it wasn't, when the bell rang, signaling that someone had entered. I had given up on a good night out, and I would have been right there because everyone who came in this late usually just wanted a pack of cigarettes or to pay for gas in cash. I put the box down and walked up to the cash register, slowing down abruptly when I saw who it was. As you might have guessed, Nick was there. He was looking at me, but leaning over the cash register. I'd be lying if I said I had any reason to be afraid. It turned out he was drunk, but I couldn't tell right away from the smell of booze that seemed to always hang in the air around me. And Josh was also on the other side of the wall. Regardless, I pondered for about 30 seconds whether I should really go, or whether I'd better run to the fridge and call Josh. Nick wasn't a young, tough guy. Years of drugs and drinking had aged him prematurely and ruined his body. But he still scared the hell out of a 20-year-old girl, let me tell you. Unfortunately, Nick made the decision for me when he turned to me, apparently tired of waiting. And that's when I immediately noticed something was wrong with him. My voice was nothing more than a pathetic whisper when I asked him what he wanted, and he just stared at me with nothing on his face to tell me what he was thinking. I was about to speak again when he spoke up, barely intelligible because of his slurred speech, and said, "Would you leave me here alone?" It took me a second to shake my head and, in a firm, hopeful voice, to tell him that Josh was in the fridge, asking if he wanted me to go get him. He stared at me silently again. I didn't care what he was saying anymore, I just wanted him to say something. That silent stare was really scaring me. I asked with more force in my voice, "What do you want, Nick?" As soon as I was silent, he smiled at me and said in a nasty, almost sing-song voice, "You're lying. You're alone." He laughed and took a step towards me, but stumbled, allowing me to take a few steps back. At this point, I definitely needed to run to Josh. I had to call him no matter what, but I couldn't believe I had gotten the situation right. Nick was very strange, but I had never felt any real danger around him before. He never seemed more than a little unstable. He continued to slowly step forward, stumbling and telling me to come over here. I just want to talk. I stayed out of his reach and told him to back off, and that I would hurt him if I had to. He found this particularly amusing, and laughed so loudly that Josh later told me that this is what made him look around the racks to see what was going on. A second later, Josh was out the door and seemed to come out of nowhere, coming between me and Nick. They didn't even say anything, just looked at each other before Josh said in a stern tone, "I think you'd better leave." Nick was speechless for a moment, and then mockingly said, "We can't take this joke." I tried not to cry at that moment. The only thing that made the situation even more frightening was the realization that if Josh wasn't around and he somehow caught me, I wouldn't stand a chance against him. Josh left me standing with my back against the wall and himself guided Nick towards the door. Completely unexpectedly for both parties, Nick turned around and took a swing at Josh. Luckily, either because he was drunk or just a lack of coordination, he completely missed Josh's face, and Josh grabbed him by his coat and knocked him to the ground, hitting Nick in the stomach or chest with his knee. I don't know which, and took the opportunity to pull him in the door and threw him outside, locking it. Josh was just turning around to tell me to call the police when we heard an eerie rumble behind us. We both jumped up and looked at the door to discover a large glass circle. It's hard to explain, but if you've ever seen in a movie or in a real car accident how someone hits the windshield but not hard enough to shatter it, and it turns white around the impact, that's exactly what the door looked like. This time, Josh didn't have to explain to me what to do. I ran over to the counter, grabbed my phone, walked to the farthest corner from the front door, and collapsed to the floor. I didn't even notice at the time, but Josh told me later that he turned to look at the glass, and that's when he first noticed that Nick had a hunting knife in his other hand. That he tried to stab Josh and didn't stab him is a mystery, and perhaps even a miracle. I sobbed when the cameraman picked up the phone. I don't know how she understood me. I was crying so hard, but from my frustration and the sounds Josh and Nick were making, yelling at each other in the background, and Nick banging loudly on the door, she realized the urgency of the situation pretty quickly. She asked where I was, and luckily she knew the address, because just as I stood up to look at the receipt and get the address, the glass shattered. I fell to the floor and she told me that the cops were on their way and that I could do my best to run or hide, even if I had to leave Josh behind. The hole wasn't big enough for him to fit through, so he did so by grabbing an ashtray from outside and throwing it at part of the window, which he hit several times, causing it to fly out. But he was not able to get through. From that opening, however, he was able to reach the lock on the door. According to Josh, he went to the door, pressed his mouth against the hole he had just made, and said in that awful sing-songy voice he had used the first time, "They'll never find you two." Needless to say, Josh, as cool as he was as panicked as I was. He was older than Nick, in his early 30s, but he was a man and not known for his fighting qualities. However, as soon as Nick unlocked and started to open the door, Josh crashed into it with his whole body, throwing Nick backwards. Josh yelled at me to run, and even though I felt like my legs were going to give out at any moment, I ran after him to the front door at the back of the store. Nick was swearing and yelling after us. The doorbell rang. Josh let out a cry of pain and kicked at the back door when he realized it wouldn't open. We found out later that Nick had moved the dumpster in front of the door and blocked the wheels in front again. It was immediately clear to both of us that he had indeed planned this, and it looked like he was really going to kill us. Nick rounded the corner, still stumbling clumsily, but already faster. That at least gave me time to close the door to the back room and lock it. I was sitting across from Josh, who had brought whatever he could find to close the door when Nick got to it. He must have heard my tears because he kept screaming my name, telling me I wasn't the one for him. He would make sure I was dead before I felt the pain of the door opening. He then started pounding on the door, demanding that I open it. I screamed and jerked as he delivered the first stab, but Josh and I immediately moved to stop him. I remember Josh and I looked into each other's eyes. We were both already crying, and I wanted so badly to say something to comfort him. but I couldn't think of anything to say. I dropped my phone as I ran to close the door, and neither of us could move to retrieve it. We didn't know how long it would be before the police arrived, and the door was wooden, so it wouldn't withstand his body blows and would offer little protection if his knife hit one of our hands. And all I could think about was that I could die, that my dog would never know why I didn't come home, that I would never get my degree or have enough money to start enjoying life, that all the other future plans my girl and I made would never come true. And then, in the most anticlimactic and beautiful finale, he suddenly just stopped talking. There was no police car honking, no screaming, nothing. It was like Nick had disappeared. Josh and I stared at each other, not daring to even breathe, listening for signs of life on the other side of the door. And we both fell to the ground as 1, 2, 3 shots rang out. There was silence. Then a voice asked if anyone was there. We weren't sure if we should speak. The voice then gave his name and said he was an off-duty medic listening to the scanner. Josh got up and moved things in front of the door, opening it just enough to poke his head out. And then the breath seemed to leave him. He opened the door and walked out into the store with a sense of relief in everything. I ran and grabbed the phone when I saw the call had been dropped or the dispatcher had hung up. When I walked into the store where Josh and our lifeguard were, he was just explaining that the police were sending a bunch of cars over the scanner, but they were all pretty far away, and he had a horrible feeling they wouldn't get there at that time. When the dispatcher said, that they would find when they got there. Nick was indeed found 2 weeks later in an old van in the woods, drinking and doing drugs so his wife wouldn't catch him, apparently because he was following us. He thought Josh wanted him gone so fast so he could call the owner again, and this time the complaint would get him fired. We were not aware that his wife had kicked him out of the house 4 days before and was going to file a restraining order against him because of the threatening text messages and phone calls she was receiving. He stated that his job was all he had left, and Josh should be punished for trying to take it away from him. He said that I wasn't really the target and that he didn't want to kill me, but he knew he had a much better chance of killing Josh with me than with Dixie, since Josh was more likely to meet with him to protect me. And the reason I am sharing this story now is because, among other things, I am the mastermind. 2 weeks ago, I got a call that Nick was scheduled to be released on June 8th of this year, barring any health issues. When I called Josh, he said he had gotten the same news the day before. Of course, neither Josh nor I work there anymore, and Josh has since moved across town to the other side of town, and I've moved to college entirely online, and am living in a new place I'm renting from a neighbor. And I don't think he's going to go after either of us. I don't see how he can blame us for what happened. I've heard so many stories like this, and everyone seems to be ready with what to do if they see the person they're writing about again. I don't think I would be any more prepared to meet him this time than I was then, to be honest. I've also been plagued by nightmares since that day, but ever since I got the call, every time I close my eyes, I hear one sentence louder and clearer than I ever have. He said, "They'll never find you two." So, first of all, I'm French, and this story took place in France a few months ago, so please excuse my English if it's not perfect. So, I was driving late at night with a friend, whose name was Bob, on a small road in the middle of nowhere. It was about 1 or 2 in the morning, I think. We were surrounded by woods and fields, typical scenery when you're outside the city. As we turned a corner in the middle of the woods, we saw a woman on the side of the road a few dozen meters in front of us. My friend, who was the driver, immediately slowed down to see if she needed help. She looked like a normal woman, not a ghost or a white woman or anything like that. Also, my friend isn't very superstitious, so I figured she was lost or maybe something more serious. Personally, when we approached this man, I'll admit I felt uneasy because I immediately knew something was wrong. I mentioned this to my friend and he replied, "No, don't worry. I'm just going to ask her if she's okay." When we stopped the car, she looked at us and said her battery was dead and she needed help. She was in her late 40s, maybe 50s, I think, with long gray hair that looked very dirty. At this point, I wondered how this was even possible. We were talking to a completely random woman in the middle of the night, in the middle of the woods. In hindsight, it seems completely bizarre and very dangerous. At the time, my friend was totally cool with the situation. I think it was some kind of unconscious kindness or something. But while I was contemplating the situation, she kept talking and said that her car was parked on a forest road to the right of the main road. She showed us a tiny dirt path that went deep into the woods. I looked at my friend. He looked at me, shrugged, and said, "Okay, you can walk ahead of the car and we'll follow you." She smiled and said, "Thank you very much. You are very nice. I didn't expect people like you." She walked away and we slowly followed her. 10 meters, 50, 100. As we got deeper into the forest, we started to get nervous. We couldn't see the road behind us. My friend started to realize that this was probably a mistake. During all of this, I tried to explain to him how dire this situation was. Finally, however, we pulled up to the entrance to the clearing, and this is where things got real. First of all, there was no car here, just an abandoned house with a completely destroyed roof and 2 trailers. It looked like some kind of marginalized camp or something. And second, the woman rushed running towards the vans and disappeared behind them. At this point, it was pretty clear that this was some kind of ambush or foul play. My friend immediately backed up, and as we pulled away as fast as the road would allow, the girl reappeared and ran toward our car. She didn't say anything, just ran. Bob backed up and we were able to quickly pull onto the main road and drive away. Best of all, we went straight to the police station a few dozen kilometers away. We told them our story and they told us that apparently we were not the first. Apparently, a couple of marginalized and mentally unstable people living there had been trying to lure drivers out by asking for help. Everyone in the neighborhood knew them, so they knew about them. And it was a very remote road, which means there weren't many strangers around. Anyway, thanks for listening, and please be careful because you never know who you might run into. My father grew up in forestry in Queensland, Australia, the son of a forester. All my life, we spent a lot of time in that forest, camping and driving through parts of the forest that only rangers drive through, and even then, only occasionally. One of the places Dad liked to take us to was a small farm in the middle of the forest that you couldn't find unless you knew the way. The locals called it Spike's Hunt. Spike was a local farmer who lived there for decades, up until the 90s, and had a reputation for being a cruel, violent, bigoted man who had no interest in human laws. He had a habit of walking up to guys in bars with earrings and ripping them off, and there were several stories of people he didn't like just disappearing. All in all, Spike wasn't a nice guy, and his farm and cabin pretty much reflected that. Every time we went into the woods, Dad would take us with him, and the cabin got more and more dilapidated, but the atmosphere was always the same. That direct feeling that we were being watched, even though Spike was long gone. As I got older, I began to notice more signs of life in the place when we came to visit. There were 44-gallon kegs full of broken beer bottles, fire pits with fairly fresh coals. Someone had definitely been there. God knows why, because by that point the place had literally turned into a snake pit. But Dad didn't seem too concerned. But one trip when I was a teenager quickly got weird. My friends and I loaded up in Dad's 4-wheel drive car and drove through the bush to Spike's, so Dad could tell his scary stories about Spike and scare us. We drove onto the property and something immediately caught my eye. Lying on the hill across from Spike's cabin was something that looked like a cowboy leaning against a log, stroking his face and dozing off. Something about the position of his body looked unnatural and uncomfortable. It didn't look like you were sitting there if you took a nap in the middle of the workday, and if you did, there was no reason for anyone to be there. The farm was long gone, and there was no forest on the property. I pointed this out to my father, and instead of letting us out of the car like he usually does, he said he wanted to drive around the farm to show us something. He claimed it was nothing, but if the figure was still there when we got back, we'd stop and check it out. Of course, whatever he wanted to show us was completely fictional, as he was just taking us around the woods for a bit. And when we got back, I noticed the hunched-over cowboy again, who hadn't moved an inch, remaining in the same unnatural pose. I yelled to my father to stop, reminding him of his promise. But he pretended he didn't hear me, locked the truck door, and drove away from the farm much faster than he'd ever driven on those forest roads. My friends and I exchanged confused looks, but we knew that when it came to this area, questioning my father was futile at best and dangerous at worst. My father denied that any of the events of that day took place afterward. My friends and I were still very curious to find out what was going on there. So a few months later, we went on our own camping trip and set out to find Spike's cabin. It took us several hours of driving through the woods to find the gate to Spike's property, but we eventually found it without Daddy's help. Once we got there, however, something went wrong, as it usually did that day. My companions jumped out of the car but suddenly froze, not wanting to approach the cabin for no apparent reason. I have to admit that the atmosphere just wasn't right that day, and we felt as if we were in something that didn't belong to us. I had a strong urge to get out, but I had spent 2 hours looking for this place, and I was going to explore it. One of my friends behaved courageously and walked with me from the car to the cabin, silently noticing more and more signs of the inhabitants, nodding in understanding between us. We didn't say anything to each other, but we were definitely on guard. Honestly, it seemed to us that someone could come back at any minute, or that they had never left the place and were just watching us while we were digging through the trash. We approached the shack and had a view of a small shed with 3 walls. I heard my friend's voice become hoarse as he beckoned me to look inside. On the ground was a huge pile of ashes from what appeared to be a campfire, and this was confirmed by the presence of a huge makeshift grill made of crisscrossed wire that was perched above the fire attached to the wall of the shed. Looking at this structure, my guess is that whoever was here hunted and cooked large chunks of their prey over a fire or something like that. Pretty clever, actually. But then my stomach churned. When my gaze moved from the grate to the ground, I saw a baby sock. Small, pink, and terribly inappropriate. Then another, then a shirt, then a ribbon of baby hair. And it was all lying next to the ashes on the ground, next to the woman's weekly Christmas cookbook. At that moment, alarm bells rang in my head, and I rallied my comrades to get the hell out of there. It was one thing to have some ranger or crazy old bushman sticking around in a ruined cabin, but there was absolutely no reason for a child to be there, and nothing good would come out of a child's clothes lying around a huge grill fire. When we got back to the campground, we were undaunted by the oppressive feeling that we were being followed, and we were so alarmed that we just packed up and decided not to stay the night. When I got home, I told my father about it, and he just brushed it off, saying that strange things were happening here. Being young and stupid, I never thought to look for missing people in this neighborhood trying to explain cowboy or baby clothes. But I can say I'll never make the mistake of going to Spike's cabin without my dad again. Right after I graduated from high school, my family moved into the house that used to belong to my great-grandmother. At first, there were 5 of us: me, my parents, my friend Kay, and my boyfriend, and now husband, who moved because he didn't want to move his family overseas. The house was a strange layout. It was a mobile home with an annex in the front as a living room and a bedroom in the back. My boyfriend had a room at one end of the house, Kay and I at the other, with the kitchen in the middle. And to get to the master bathroom, you had to go through the room Kay and I shared. It started with little things, strange sensations, moving objects, sounds of furniture being dragged and moved. In particular, the bathroom door. We started keeping it closed at night, otherwise it would open and close on its own. It also did this constantly, day and night. We checked for drafts and anything that could cause this, but found nothing. We also started to notice that whenever it started to move, if we got annoyed and told it to stop, the door would immediately stop moving. One night when we weren't in bed, Kay got up to go to the bathroom. I heard her come out of the bathroom without closing the door, and I told her to close it because it was bothering me. And I heard the long creak of the door slowly closing, but not staying shut. I angrily told her to close it all the way, but when she answered, it wasn't me, but a horrible voice from the opposite corner of the room. I turned on the light then, and the door closed completely before it could catch on the frame. I opened the door, but there was nothing there. Obviously, we were completely insane. I slammed the door shut and then told her that was why I kept the door closed. There was also a knock, as I like to call it. We had 3 doors in our house facing the street, and quite often we would hear 3 knocks on any one of those doors. I always look out the window before I open the door when we're not expecting guests because you never know who might be there. So I checked the window, but there was no one there. I was standing in front of the back door when it happened, and through the window in the door, I could clearly see that no one was there, but the door shook. That's how hard it had been hit. Shortly after that, my boyfriend started having vivid nightmares about something trying to pull him out of bed. Later, my mother's friend was with her toddler. He was studying like a normal kid his age, and stopped at the door to my boyfriend's room and stared at him. Then he came back and started talking about the ghost and pointing to my boyfriend's room. No one was talking about anything, not even ghosts or scary things, and it wasn't that close to Halloween, so we have no idea where it came from. But we tried to brush it off because it's just a kid saying stupid things, right? But he was persistent. We tried to get details, but all he would say was, "Go ahead and ghost." I directed him back into the room, and he pointed to a small play closet and insisted, "Ghost, go see." I opened the door for him, but there was nothing there, but he insisted it was a ghost. The scariest night in our house was when we had been lying in bed for about 45 minutes, when suddenly something hit the bed with such force that the entire mattress shook. My bed frame wouldn't fit in the small room, so the mattress was on the floor on top of the spring. But Kay and I definitely felt it. We turned on the light but there was nothing there, so we moved as far away from the edge of the bed as possible and tried to fall asleep. But then something grabbed Kay's leg and pulled at the blanket. Again, the light showed nothing, and we were horrified. And then something hit the wall next to the other side of the bed. This went on all night, and eventually we stayed in the living room to sleep, and my dad stayed with us. A few months later, my parents moved into the house they were working on and left us in it. Kay and I moved into the master bedroom, and our old room was turned into a place to keep kennels for our 2 new puppies. 3 times my 8-month-old Pete came into that room. He would throw himself on the floor, his hair would stand up, he would scream and roar, fixated on the top corner of the room. When he would do that, I had to physically drag him out of the room and close the door to get him to calm down. The other dog also somehow got out of the locked kennel when he was left there alone, and the kennel was still locked and secured. We still don't know how he did it. Kay and my mother also started hearing voices when they were left there alone, and the discomfort only increased. One night something started clawing at our bedroom door, and we were so scared that I called my boyfriend to look at the other side of the door because I was too scared to open it. During Hurricane Harvey, there was 5 feet of water in the house. We gutted it and ended up moving. I was never sad about losing that house. I was even somewhat relieved to be rid of it, to be honest, and really hoped the flooding had taken out whatever was in there. Today was a particularly slow day at work, and I spent some time reading some stories and thought that maybe enough time had passed, and now I could share something else. I had a friend who was very into the occult. Unfortunately, I was the one who got him started in the first place. We shared an affinity for the paranormal and all things strange, so I thought he would be interested in the subject. But he started delving into the topic to the point where he wouldn't talk about anything else. He would actually interrupt the conversation and bring the topic back to occult matters. Tough, I know, but sometimes people go through phases where their interest is all they want to talk about, right? For the most part, it was forgivable. I guess I should also point out that this particular friend didn't have a very large circle of friends. His depression and introverted nature kept him inward. He had no luck in his relationships with women. I guess his world was small. I enjoyed hanging out with him and tried to be a good friend. I didn't want to brush him off because he was acting a little weirder than usual. And honestly, for a long time he was a perfectly normal guy. We talked, we played PlayStation games. Sometimes we went to see movies. with my boyfriend accompanying us. We walked in the park and went swimming. All in all, we were having a great time, but it all went downhill when he started smoking DMT. Personally, I think psychedelics are an amazing tool that can shed light on your life, but they should be treated with caution and respect. A friend of mine went so far as to do it himself, which apparently was pretty easy to do after a little bit of research. He smoked it daily, several times a day. However, for those unfamiliar with this substance, I will say that when you smoke it, you are transported to another world, to a whole new level of existence. Your body and yourself no longer exist. You are just exploring this alternate dream reality. People also see different things there, and I think you can imagine what it can do to a person if they smoke it 30 times a day. He also started telling me that he's reincarnated Osiris, that he sees Egyptian characters everywhere in walking life, that he had 4 long conversations with creatures in his bedroom, even though he didn't smoke. Of course, I was very disturbed to hear all this and told him that he needed to take a serious break, do nothing for a few months, so that he could get a firm grip on reality again. I also kept in touch with him at this point because he clearly needed help, and as I said, he didn't have many friends who could provide it. Also, he was the black sheep of the family, so I knew he wouldn't get any support from them. However, he was very close to his sister, and I contacted her via Facebook to express my concerns. I convinced her to talk to him about psychiatric help because he was past the point of no return. I'm not entirely sure she took my message seriously, since we didn't know each other. Also, she was at least 6 years younger than us, and may not have realized how serious the situation was becoming. Anyway, I'm getting to the part where things get really creepy. So my boyfriend had arranged to go play with our friend at the park. I didn't really want to go because I felt like I needed a break from him and his nonsense. I just couldn't handle him that day. However, my boyfriend said he wasn't that bad and we went anyway. We got to the park and yes, he was normal, talking about Egypt, imaginary gods that only he knows the truth about, etc. But he also had a big hunting knife that he fiddled with the whole time we were walking. He told us that he uses it in ceremonial magic and that it helps ward off negative thoughts. It really upset me when I saw him do it. He also did it when he took a knife and made a stabbing motion near his heart or head. It was like he was faking the knife by constantly talking to me about my boyfriend. I think we were both on edge and didn't know what to say or do. I tried to distract him from it by bringing up other topics that might interest him, but he continued his ritual. We were on the trail, so we couldn't just say goodbye and leave, but had to go back to the car and drop him off. My boyfriend had the good idea of having lunch after the walk, even though I tried my best to make him look like, "No, you're crazy. What makes you think I want to spend more time with this guy?" But apparently it wasn't very effective, or my boyfriend just ignored it. Anyway, we got in the car to go to lunch. In the car I was driving, my boyfriend was in the passenger seat, and our weird friend was in the back. As we were driving through a busy part of town with all the stores and restaurants, I heard the distinctive sound of my belt buckle unbuckling, and then I hear the most horrible sound imaginable. I looked out of the corner of my eye, and my suspicions were confirmed. That crazy dude in the back seat was jerking off hard, pants down, bare ass lying on the seat, hitting it as hard as if he wanted to rip it off. Instantly I felt sick, and all the nervous energy I had built up during the day spilled out of my head. I tried not to shake and at the same time tried to ignore it and make my way through the dense traffic. I guess I was having some sort of freeze reaction, but the whole time I was thinking about the fact that he had a huge knife in his pocket and was obviously completely out of it. Honestly, I was also afraid to say anything or confront him because I didn't know how he would react. But my boyfriend didn't even seem to notice it and was just babbling about God knows what the whole time. I couldn't listen because my thoughts were 100% focused on driving and trying to pretend I didn't know what was going on in my back seat. However, we got to the restaurant and my boyfriend ran inside to grab a bite to eat. This means I'm alone in the car with our friend, and I'm trying to pretend I'm browsing on my phone, even though I'm actually watching and listening as much as possible, and we're not talking. Finally, my boyfriend comes back, and I complain that I'm tired. It's been a long day, let's drop him off, etc. I take us to our friend's car and he doesn't get out of the car. He just sits there. I have to be a little rude and ask him to get out and drive home. He gets out of the car and goes to his passenger side. I got really scared and suspected the worst. He pulled a gun out of some bag that was on the seat and just walked up to our car with it. I still don't know why I did it, but I was really angry, so I just got out of the car and walked over to him. I was about 3 meters away from him, and I saw that it was a loaded 9mm pistol. I kept asking him, "What are you doing?" Because apparently, that's all my brain could come up with. I told him to get in his car and drive home. But the whole time he didn't say anything, just cried and made wild eyes at me. However, for some reason, he did get in the car and drive away. I told my boyfriend that we were never going to see this guy again, and that I didn't want him to talk to him. No contact. Nothing. It's been a few months now, and he occasionally texts me via PlayStation or on my phone. He says a lot of random things, and I just ignore him. Also found out he moved to Nashville. I don't know why. He had a roommate, and I think their girlfriend lived there or something. I'm not sure of the situation at all. However, I think maybe he decided to turn his life around and start over. Who knows? I still think it's best to just cut off all contact and give him a chance to rebuild. I'm no longer interested in being friends with him, and I know he needs help that I can't offer. I reached out to his sister again and informed her that he does indeed have a gun. She somehow managed to wrestle it from him, but in the end it didn't help anything. One day around 11 p.m. I woke up to a phone call. It's a man claiming to be a detective from Gallatin, Tennessee, and my heart sinks. I start sweating and immediately ask what happened, and it turns out that my former friend stabbed someone on Halloween. I don't know all the details, and there aren't many articles about it, but it's all just surreal to me, and I guess I just feel lucky. I'm lucky I didn't get shot last summer. I broke my left leg in the fall of 2018 and needed surgery. I lived in a not-so-great neighborhood in southwest Detroit. Because of the surgery, I was staying with relatives while I recovered, but after the first few days, I went home to pack and planned to stay there and return to my family's house the next day. I walked into my house talking to a friend who called a few minutes before I walked in the door. I really wanted to go to the bathroom, and holding the phone between my ear and shoulder, I sort of squatted as I made my way through the bungalow to the back of the house. As I talked and heard the clatter of crutches, I thought I could hear noises coming from the attic, but it wasn't until I got into the bathroom and stopped that I was sure someone or something was upstairs. I said to my friend something like, "Hey, wait, there's something up here." At first, for a split second, I thought there was an animal living in the house. No sooner had I said that than there was a loud cracking sound across the floor, seemingly right above me, like a grown man falling. And in the attic, too. It was the sort of attic that could be turned into a bedroom and that stretched the entire length of the house, and my height was 6 feet, and I could stand right in the middle of it. My friend was immediately surprised, replying, "What is that?" She really thought I had fallen, and I replied that no, someone had broken into the house. They were upstairs. I walked into the house, on crutches no less, my back to the door, and wait for someone to come out of somewhere. I put the phone to my ear again and tell my friend I need to call back so I can call a friend who lives nearby. There is no answer. Not even 60 seconds have passed since I left. Then, as luck would have it, a police cruiser pulls out of an alley in my neighborhood. I see them and they see me, so I wait for them to stop, and they do. However, these were not your average police officers. Like I said, it's not the biggest neighborhood. It was an unmarked police car with plainclothes officers, a gang squad car or something, and they are actually called jump-out boys here. I explain what just happened, that I had just gotten home and that I thought someone was in my house. It's been about 3 or 4 minutes since I showed up. 4 police officers with guns in their hands walk through my house, and I follow them. They come to the stairs, call the Detroit police a few times, and then go upstairs. I wait downstairs, and after about a minute they come down and don't say anything to me. There's nobody there, and as soon as they come in, they're gone. I thank them and they just leave. It's been no more than 8 minutes, and I'm just looking at what happened, standing very close to the door to my room, trying to digest everything and wondering what I heard. It's probably been about 20 seconds, and I'm just standing in silence with my ear pressed against the roof of the house when I hear a sound like dragging, starting at the back of the house and getting louder and louder as I get closer to the front. Soon it was right above me, the loudest cracking sound, like it was trying to go right through the floor that separated me from it, and I vaguely got out of there and quickly returned to my family. After about 5 days, I came back and was very worried while I was there, but nothing happened and life there gradually returned to normal. In the end, I really don't know what happened that day. Maybe someone was living on my roof, maybe someone broke in, or maybe something paranormal was going on. You know, the woods are safe. You only have to worry about people. The one incident I'll never forget is when a man just showed up at our campsite, located a few miles from the actual campsite, and watched us from a distance behind different trees. Several people said hello to us, but he didn't respond, and when he saw the kids, he tried to talk to them several times. We were a large group of adults, but since we had kids with us, a few guys finally approached and confronted him. He claimed he wasn't following us and just walked away. Then, later that night, he drove up in a beat-up van and parked next to our makeshift playground, blocking us in. The van itself was amazing and very creepy. There were children's underwear, toys, and trash lying on the dashboard. It was getting dark, and we were sitting around the fire when suddenly he just walked over and stood in our little circle. He immediately noticed that all the little ones had already gone to bed, which of course immediately startled me. The boys asked him to go half a mile away, not realizing what was the matter. After about half an hour, I saw him standing behind a tree smoking. I couldn't see him, but I could see the end of his cigarette, so I guessed it was him. But he was just watching and smoking. It was a very unsettling experience to watch a man in the wilderness who seemed to be focused on our children, not to mention that of the 3 other families we were with. My family of 4 was the only one in the tent that didn't feel as safe as an RV or camper. D. I went to bed with our 2 children so they wouldn't be alone. Our tent was on the far side of the site, away from the campfire. Shortly after the children fell asleep, I heard rustling in the woods around the tent and called my husband's name, thinking he was wandering in the dark, looking for our tent door. When he didn't answer, I unzipped the door and shined the flashlight right at the creepy guy's feet. I immediately jumped up and started screaming. All the guys immediately ran away from the fire, and the creepy guy just stood there looking at us, didn't explain anything, didn't say anything, not that he was okay, then turned around and just walked away. By this point, I was more than fed up. We gathered our things and put them in the car, asking our friends to leave, but they didn't want to. I was the only adult who hadn't been drinking. No one was able to make it home. I drove all the way home with my significant other, alert and attentive. The rest of our friends had guns and all had reliable campers and RVs to sleep in. The next night they returned home and faced this horror in an even stranger way. By the way, we each went to the authorities, but that's why I don't camp in remote places anymore. So, this was about 5 months ago. I don't remember it with complete clarity, I admit, and I'm definitely not the best at retelling the events of my life, so bear with me, I'll try. It was about 2 a.m. in the morning in downtown Denver. A friend of ours is taking D. My partner and I usually stay the night, but we had plans for the following Monday and needed to leave early. So we said goodbye to everyone, grabbed our stuff and hit the road. It wasn't a long walk to the car, no more than a block, and my significant other, and I started walking and chatting about the session. Then we both fell silent at the same time. Someone was walking behind us, I don't know how, but we both knew it was going to be bad news. He continued to follow us to the parking lot, and just before we entered, he spoke to us. "Are you 18 or older?" I was already a little older, 5'10", and up, and knew how to keep my cool when it came to badasses. But this guy seemed different. He was a full foot taller than me, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed man with a devilishly obnoxious grin. Being the dumb, polite person that I am, I said something like, yeah, why?" And he started to say something like, "Do you pay taxes?" I quickly replied that, "Sorry, we're not at that stage of life yet." He quickly responds with a long tirade about how taxes are terrible. You should never pay them. They use your taxes to kill people all the time. The government kills people, everyone kills people, and they get away with it so easily. Then he started coming closer and closer to us. My partner had already pulled into the garage and I was stupidly afraid to move, trying to focus on myself instead of her. He came within a few centimeters of my face, me trying to nonchalantly back away, keeping my movements natural, straightening my back, compensating for the fact that this man was bigger than me. Though his breath was awful and with every word that came out of his mouth I could smell the alcohol, and he still had the blue bracelet on his arm, I don't know if it was bar-related or not. All I know is that he had a bracelet. However, he continues his tirade, and my other half tries to react a little. He starts walking away from me towards her. After a few glances between her and I, we realize that we should just do whatever this guy says. When she stops arguing, he goes from taxes to politicians to genocide. And he says, "You know, I could kill anyone and get away with it." Anyone can. The government is watching us, but they don't care. Besides, they'll never know. His words didn't make much sense. And then he says we're killing the planet, a problem that could be solved if it had a smaller population. The guy was in my face again, keeping as close as possible. Whenever one of us reached for the phone or watch or whatever, he would switch to them. Not that it was a compliment, but he was very perceptive for someone who I assume was drunk to the point of unconsciousness. The conversation lasts about 5 to 10 minutes, and it feels like an hour. I'm pretty disgusted by it, but I agree with everything he says. At this point, he seems to have completely forgotten about my other half. I introduced myself, giving my character's name, and shook his hand, which allowed me to see a bunch of marks on his arm. I was a little scared, thinking I was about to get stabbed or something. I've never been in a fight, so how the hell am I supposed to handle this? At that, he smiled and agreed, and then his demeanor changed. Still snuggled too close to me, he started scratching himself all over my body, repeatedly reaching for my left pocket every time he said kill, or even mentioned it. Honestly, I was more pissed off than scared at this point, and started trying to get around him, as backing away was just driving me into a wall. But nothing worked. No matter how I tried to get away or wherever I tried to go, he was always right in my face, talking about how he could kill anyone he wanted, that it would solve all the world's problems if people would just go out and kill hundreds of others. Eventually, I just got sick of it, and I took a step to the right, and then a quick left, and drove out of the parking garage. I followed me, and my partner followed him, but finally we were back in the open again. I cast desperate glances at the people passing by, and he pressed closer and closer to me, so close that he was almost right up against me. I don't know what finally came over me, but I grabbed my lover's hand, smiled as best I could, and said, "I just want to hold your hand." As a gay man who has encountered homophobes and crazy people more than once, this definitely seemed like the worst idea to me. She held out her hand to me. I yanked it away, and this man who seemed like a huge threat immediately stepped back, saying, "Oh, you were together? Oh yeah, no, I don't mind. Good night." It's pretty funny, but also a little weird that this is the only time my sexuality has saved me, rather than endangered me. We waited until he was well outside and headed straight for the car. Within seconds, we got in it, locked the door, and drove off. The whole car was shaking. Later, we also passed him on the road, and he and I looked at each other one last time. At the time this story happened, my friend and I were federal law enforcement officers. We were working in southeastern Arizona at the time, and we both enjoyed the outdoors. He was mountaineering, hiking all over the world and the like. I, on the other hand, had hiked all over the U.S., had hunting experience in Florida, and was comfortable in remote wilderness areas, often alone. In my experience, Chiricahua is not a very remote place, hardly the best place I've been, but last winter we went there in the National Monument area just to walk around and admire the scenery. Turns out the overhanging cliffs and views were very beautiful. Spoiler alert, it was. It should also be noted that I had only recently learned about the missing 411, and was not aware of it at the time. We arrived and brought our service pistols, which we normally carried off duty. We then walked down the trail from one of the parking lots for about an hour. There were lots of rocks and small ledges, grottos and caves. It was overcast when we arrived, but clear enough for the sun to shine. We drove for an hour on a winding trail that we estimated took about 2.5 hours. At this point, it was completely overcast. There was moderate fog and very little precipitation. I remember it being particularly dark at this point. Nevertheless, we enjoyed the hike even though the temperature had dropped significantly. Shortly after the fog had descended, which was the last part of the weather change, we heard 3 strange thumps from the overhanging rock at the top of the gorge we were in at that moment. The sound vaguely resembled the striking of a heavy instrument on rock. 2 knocks a quarter of a second apart, a slight second delay, then a third knock. These 3 knocks were repeated several times from this spot, but we stopped as soon as we heard them, and for some reason immediately became alarmed. After several series of knocks, the knocking ceased, and we began to withdraw about 50 yards, when we heard the same several series of knocks from the opposite side of the ravine. Then again from the 3rd position. We were terribly frightened. We ran to the car without looking back, and drove away. We never went there again in our lives.